Scary telling.
The funeral was a blur. I was barely holding it together, trying to maintain a facade of composure as I said goodbye to my wife. I knew I should be feeling more, but the emotions just wouldn't come. Everything felt numb and distant. As I looked out at the sea of faces, I saw my wife's sister in the front row, her face twisted in grief. I went to sit next to her, hoping that maybe I could offer her some comfort. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she was my wife. The resemblance was uncanny. I hugged her tightly, not sure what else to do. As I held her, I couldn't help but notice that she felt different. Her body was softer, and she smelled different. I pulled back, feeling confused and disoriented. As the service ended, I brought my wife's body back home. It felt surreal, like I was going through the motions of someone else's life. As I sat with her in the living room, something inside me broke. I felt a sense of overwhelming sadness and loss wash over me, and I started to cry. My wife's sister came over to me, wrapping me in a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I miss her so much." As she held me, I felt a sense of comfort and familiarity. Her touch felt like my wife's, and her voice sounded the same. I clung to her, feeling like she was the only anchor I had left in a world that had suddenly become unmoored. But as the moments passed, something started to feel wrong. She was holding me too tightly, and her breathing felt uneven. I pulled back, looking into her eyes, and suddenly, everything fell into place. "You're not my wife," I whispered. Her face twisted in confusion and fear, and I knew that everything I had suspected was true. My wife's sister was not who she claimed to be. She was someone else entirely, someone who had taken my wife's place and stolen her life. After the funeral, I went through the motions of trying to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. But something felt off. Every time I looked at my wife's sister, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the days passed, the unease grew. My wife's sister was living with me, but it felt like she was a stranger. She didn't react the way my wife would have, and her mannerisms seemed slightly off. She didn't laugh at my jokes or snuggle up to me on the couch the way my wife used to. At first, I tried to ignore my growing unease, thinking that I was just imagining things. But the more I watched her, the more convinced I became that something was wrong. One day, I came home early from work and found her in the kitchen, making dinner. She was humming a tune I didn't recognize, and as I watched her, I realized that I didn't know this woman at all. I felt like I was living with a complete stranger. I sat down at the kitchen table, watching her chop vegetables. "How are you holding up?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She looked up at me, her eyes haunted. "I miss her so much," she said softly. "It's hard being here, in the house where we used to live." I nodded sympathetically, but inside, I was seething. How dare she pretend to be my wife and use my wife's death to manipulate me? That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. I kept thinking about all the little things that were wrong about my wife's sister. The way she stirred her tea, the way she laughed, the way she touched me. Nothing felt right. As I lay there, I knew that I couldn't keep living like this. I had to find out the truth about who this woman really was. The more time I spent with my wife's imposter sister, the more convinced I became that something was seriously wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was living a lie and that my wife's death was somehow connected to her. I started to do some digging, going through old photos and documents to try and piece together what had really happened. As I sifted through old memories, I started to notice something strange. In all the photos of my wife and her sister, they looked almost identical. But as I looked closer, I started to see subtle differences. My wife's sister had a slightly wider nose and a mole on her left cheek that my wife didn't have. It was like someone had tried to make them look exactly the same, but they weren't quite identical. It was a subtle difference, but it was enough to raise my suspicions. I started to look through old letters and journals, trying to find any clues about my wife's past. I uncovered old diaries that my wife had kept, detailing her childhood and adolescence. But as I read through them, I started to notice that there were gaps in the timeline. There were whole years missing, where my wife hadn't written anything at all. It was like she was trying to cover something up, but I couldn't figure out what. I started to talk to people who had known my wife and her sister, trying to get a sense of what their relationship had been like. Most people told me that the two sisters had been incredibly close, almost like they were the same person. But there were a few people who had stories that didn't quite add up. They talked about strange behaviors and unusual occurrences that didn't quite fit with the picture of my wife's life that I had been presented with. I started to put together a timeline, trying to fill in the gaps and make sense of everything. It was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, and each new piece I found only raised more questions. But as I dug deeper, I knew that I was getting closer to the truth. I could feel it in my bones. And I knew that whatever I uncovered, it was going to be something that would change everything. As I continued to investigate my wife's past, I started to piece together a dark and twisted web of lies and deceit. I uncovered evidence that my wife's twin sister had been the one who was supposed to die, and that she had orchestrated a plan to take her sister's place and steal her life. I felt sick to my stomach as I read through old letters and journals that my wife's sister had written, detailing her plans to switch places with my wife. It was like reading the confessions of a madwoman. But as the evidence mounted, I knew that I couldn't keep it to myself. I had to confront the imposter and force her to reveal the truth. One evening, as we sat in the living room, I took a deep breath and turned to her. "I know who you really are," I said. She looked up at me, fear in her eyes. "What are you talking about?" "I know that you're not my wife," I said. "I know that you're her twin sister, and that you switched places with her after she died." For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just looked at me, her face twisted in horror. "How did you find out?" she whispered. "I've been doing some investigating," I said. "I know everything. And now it's time for you to tell me the truth." She took a deep breath and started to speak. She told me how she had always been jealous of her sister, how she had always wanted to be the one who was loved and adored. After my wife's death, she saw an opportunity to make her dream a reality. She had spent months planning and preparing, studying my wife's mannerisms and learning everything she could about her life. She had fooled everyone, even me. But now, the truth was out, and there was no going back. As she finished speaking, I felt a sense of numbness wash over me. I had suspected the truth, but hearing it confirmed was like a blow to the stomach. The person I had loved and trusted was gone, replaced by a stranger who had stolen her life. I didn't know what to say or do. Everything felt surreal, like I was living in a nightmare. The imposter sat across from me, her face twisted in fear and desperation. And in that moment, I knew that my life would never be the same again. The imposter had shattered everything I thought I knew, and now I was left to pick up the pieces and try to rebuild from the rubble of my shattered reality. After the truth had been revealed, everything in my life had changed. The woman I had loved and thought I knew had never existed, and the person living in my house was a complete stranger. I spent days trying to come to terms with what had happened. I went through the motions of my life, but everything felt surreal and disconnected. I didn't know who to trust or where to turn. But as the days passed, something started to shift inside me. I realized that I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a world of lies and deceit. I had to find a way to move forward and start living my life again. I started by talking to people who had known my wife and her sister. I tried to get a sense of who my wife really was, beyond the lies that had been told about her. I visited her childhood home and talked to her old friends and neighbors. I pored over old photo albums and journals, trying to find some sense of the woman I had loved. And as I did, I started to realize that my wife had been more than just a victim of her sister's deception. She had been a real person, with hopes and dreams and fears just like anyone else. I started to see her as a person rather than just a memory. And in doing so, I began to find a way to move on from the nightmare that had consumed me. It wasn't easy. Every day was a struggle, and there were times when I felt like giving up. But as time passed, I started to find moments of clarity and peace. I went on long walks in the woods, taking in the beauty of the natural world. I started to read books again, losing myself in the worlds of fiction and fantasy. And slowly but surely, I started to feel like I was living again. I knew that I would never forget what had happened, but I also knew that I couldn't let it define me. In the end, I realized that life was full of surprises, some of them good and some of them bad. But it was up to me to decide how I would react to them. I could either let the darkness consume me, or I could find a way to embrace the light. And so, I chose to live. I chose to embrace the uncertainty and the fear and the pain, knowing that they were all a part of what made life worth living. And as I looked towards the future, I knew that whatever it held, I was ready to face it head on.